Today, the event is hosted by Jeffrey Nava. He has been teaching at Ideas over the past few years, so some of you may not know him yet. He's a very important member of our faculty, and he's going to be both the moderator and the sort of MC. So my introduction is going to be extremely short. And actually, I'm going to use something that Jeffrey said a few minutes ago, which is we started organizing this past year events around books and around book lunches, just for the love of books and for the love of reading. And we happen to have a lot of faculty members that are actively putting a lot of books out there in the world, and they're an intrinsic and important part of our pedagogy and the things we do at school. This is a very different book. I'm not going to try to explain it or put words in anybody's mouth, but I'm very excited to have this kind of book be part of our event, and very much look forward to the presentation. So thank you so much, Rainier, for being here. And Jeffrey, with that, I will pass it on to you.
Hi, everyone. Rainier's observations about his professional encounters are invaluable to our thinking about architecture. The research we do in universities produce crucial knowledge, and so do situations that we might write off as the mundane day-to-day activities of the working architect, like interacting with clients and government agencies, coordinating responsibilities, navigating office politics, attending business development events, and of course, getting into the nitty-gritty of each project. It would be easy to get lost in these obligatory routines, whereas for Rainier, it seems like client relations, administrative reviews and approvals, and project management are the raw source material for high-level insights about the field of architecture and the purpose of the architect. In his latest book, The Masterplan, these topics are woven into the architect's internal dialogue, meaning the mind's dialogue of reconciling the small wins and losses of the day with one's life story, the reason that one gives for being an architect. This external workflow and internal negotiation are played out in epic proportions on the global real estate stage in the book. Rainier will describe the misadventures of the endearingly tragic main character, Rodrigo Jr., in the context of some of his recent OMA projects. Reinier de Graaf is a partner at Office for Metropolitan Architecture, where he leads projects in Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. Rainier is the co-founder of OMA's think tank AMO, and Sir Arthur Marshall Visiting Professor of Urban Design at University of Cambridge. He is the author of Four Walls and a Roof, The Complex Nature of a Simple Profession, and the recently published novel, The Masterplan. After his talk, there will be time to ask questions. There will be copies of the book available, and he'll be here to sign one for you if you wish. Please join me in welcoming Rainier to UCLA.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for the, I hope I'll be able to live up to the introduction. This is meant to be a book launch, and book launches normally take the form of interviews, reading, and talking without any visual material, but I was assured that that wasn't a very good idea if I wanted to keep anybody's attention longer than 5 minutes. So, what I've done is the following. The book is a novel, and the great thing about a novel is deniability. You can say it's all fiction, and therefore you can say anything you want. You can say the things you cannot say in a non-fiction book because you're bound to confidentiality, etc., blah, 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 blah. People might feel insulted. But in a novel, the people don't exist, so you can insult everybody without doing so. So what I've tried to do for this talk is, in a way, while normally the authors of fiction have to be enormously guarded as to what inspired them, how much of their own life is in the book, etc., 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 I've decided to let that go and in a way compose the lecture with our work, our projects, our experiences, in as much as they informed the book. So it's in many ways a very candid talk. I don't know whether it'll be recorded, but it doesn't matter. I'll briefly start about. So the book is about an architect, 40 years old, which makes him a young architect in the context of our profession. And he gets the opportunity of a lifetime. A random person at a real estate fair approaches him to design an entire city. And that city is the capital of a breakaway African republic. It's an enormous city for more than 1 million families. It's a dream commission. It almost sounds too good to be true. And in the course of the book, it of course becomes apparent that it is too good to be true. And the main character becomes a victim of his own ambition, and he becomes entangled in a web of corruption. He is framed. He gets to be made the face of that corruption, and he ends up having to defend himself in court. And towards the end of the book, he has to make some tough life choices. But I won't give those away, because then I would give the plot away. So that's the book. The interesting about this book is that it's been translated, and one of the first languages it was translated in is not actually Russian, but it was Ukrainian a couple of months ago, and it's an almost sardonic twist that it was translated for the Ukrainian market, or at least what was left of it in this current day and age. This is a very serious image, obviously, but it's also a very historic image, because to me it is like the last parenthesis to a period that started with this. The images even look alike. This is the Russian constitutional crisis, where in a way a missile put an end to the parliament that was guarding the Soviet Union at the time, and in a way consolidated the dissolution of the Soviet Union that happened in 1991, which in many ways marked the beginning of a very interesting period. 1991 was also the year that Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History. The premise of that book is basically the following, that while before 1991, we had a world consisting of opposing ideologies, a capitalist bloc, a communist bloc, and a non-aligned bloc. That after 1991, it'll only be a matter of time before the entire world is the same, before the entire world is democratic, and before the entire world will be a level playing field for liberal democratic values. This is the period, the 90s, in which offices like ours grew immensely, and from being a somewhat quaint Dutch office, we truly became a global office with projects on almost every continent. And while we worked in the whole world, of course, slowly but surely, the whole world came to work at us in a kind of very early manifestation of diversity. Our office in the beginning to mid-90s already looked like this. And this is not just to celebrate the idea of diversity or to sort of manifestly profess a form of political correctness. I would say that that diversity underlies really the creative formula of our office, in the sense that our office is an office where there is no majority. It's an ecology of minorities. The common language is English, bad English most of the time. And the creative process is one of constant doubt, constant interrogation, in which there are very, very few a prioris. The kind of balding chap to the left of this image is our founder, who, as you can see, is the most extreme sufferer of doubt, and still is. Anyway, in that context, we got more work, and particularly we got larger work. We got to build the head office for China Central Television, a commission that was acquired in 2001. in 2001, ironically, at a moment that we had the choice to either participate in the reconstruction of the World Trade Center in New York or in the headquarters of China Television. And funny and weird as it may sound, at the time, that was a fairly neutral choice. At the time, that was mostly a business decision. While we expected that the World Trade Center would become a very long American talk show, we knew the China headquarters would be built. There were the Olympics for 2008, so we chose to participate in the Chinese competition, won it, and got to execute it. But that was that world. But of course, we know that 30 years, more than 30 years later, the world hasn't developed like this. While our project went global, the global condition that was meant to ensue in tandem never really ensued. This is our reading of the world currently, admittedly crude. The world, again, just like before Fukuyama, has three categories. It has democracies, or at least places where you have elections. It has non-democracies, there you don't have elections, or there is only one party to choose from. And then there are pseudo-democracies, an increasingly successful category where you have elections, but you know the outcome in advance. It means also that the portfolio of project is and quickly became subject to many, many more complications than people realized. And I would like to show a few examples of projects that never materialized, but were nevertheless a very instructive experience about the current world. The first one is in Kazakhstan, which I think we actually got through Moise Mostafavi. I don't know how. Kazakhstan, of course, a former Soviet republic with all the hallmarks of former Soviet republic, heavy industry, polluted soil, but also the occasional impressive things of the communist system, like large social housing projects, and of course a country that in its early encounter with capitalism took over the worst traits of capitalism. This is a nightclub very aptly called Petroleum. The new period also meant a new period of architecture, a kind of orgy of bad taste postmodernism and Liebeskind. It's a kind of a mystery. And of course, we wouldn't be if we wouldn't go into a country like that being hugely fascinated about the formal experiment of the system which they had just cast aside, about the early constructivist models that we found, which we happily mimicked, tried the same experiments in the office, proposed a university campus there more or less based on those formal experiments here in the beautiful Kazakh snow. That's another image of our project. And these were our clients. We had very interesting discussion with our clients, mostly antagonistic. Tomorrow we need to present the options to our bosses. We cannot just say, Omar told us it's better. We need to prove it with argument. I don't want to personally stand to idea, and there it goes on. So then our project leader sort of mildly contests the idea, okay, well, we need some time to prepare the option. And then it goes on. Richard, I've got marked copies, which you gave me proving the evidence of agreement. It is strange to see your resistance. I will report the issue to Yermek. Now, Yermek looked like this. It kind of got worse. The project wasn't tendered. There was a contractor in place called the Mabatex Group, which, on closer research, turned out to be owned by a gentleman who had made his fortune on arms trading from the Kosovo Liberation Front, who had ties to early Yeltsin, basically started a construction empire, a former arms dealer in the Soviet Union, or in the post-Soviet Union era, and that somehow meant the end of that project. But we got, this was meant to be a science city. We got another chance at a science city, this time in Russia itself, on the outskirts of Moscow, a project headed by one of Russia's, at the time, richest men. He's currently on the sanctions list, Viktor Vekselberg, where there was a plan to also make a very, very large science city, the Russian equivalent of Silicon Valley, they called it, to the west of Moscow. A competition in which we participate, a competition of which for the longest time it looked like we would win. But we were up against a French contender. And the French contender, since it was the year of Russian and French friendship, and the final ceremony of the victory ceremony of the competition had already been planned in France. The competition had a kind of a predictive outcome. We got, as a kind of consolation prize, to design a quarter of that big urban plan, to elaborate it architecturally, which went up to the highest echelons of Russian government. As you can see here, the former president, who over time got replaced by the current president, and the current president, in a way, axed the whole hobby of his predecessor. So that was another project out of the window, probably for the better. The world as it is, with its three categories, has a very interesting other trait to it. For the longest time, in the early 90s, it was an implicit promise to countries that if they became democratic, they would become richer, that economic success and free elections were tied together, that was the best possible ticket for countries to achieve prosperity in the shortest possible time. If you look at the money at the disposal of governments today, particularly in the form of sovereign wealth funds, you can see that that is hardly the case. Norway is the only democracy in the top five. But if you add up all the money at the disposal of governments together, it is by far the non-democracies that have the most money at their disposal, and particularly to spend on urban developments. This is Dubai in the early 90s. This is that same street. This is Sheikh Zayed Road. That same street 25 years later. Basically, an entire metropolis emerged overnight. A metropolis that never stops growing, that keeps announcing ever more big versions of itself in a way that becomes the decorum of a lifestyle. A metropolis that always shows the world a map of how it is not, in which most of the developments that you see in the sea are not built, they're simply photoshopped into a map, but the announcement in a way has taken the place of reality. The whole city is kind of a tapestry of urban developments, which are generated like theme parks, individual real estate developments that you can see here, competing with each other in terms of the spectacle they generate, largely because they're all designed for a population that has yet to emerge. If traditional urbanism, in a way, is a design in response to a certain demographic need, here urbanism is an entrepreneurial tool to attract people to the place. And this looks like it's a landscape of free competition between property development companies, but there is another side to that story. If you look at the logos of all the real estate developers active in a place like Dubai, you trace back their ownership. They are all part of one of three holdings, which in turn are all majority owned by the royal family. So when you see an image like this, it looks like a landscape of free enterprise, of free competition, but it in fact is a carefully concealed monopoly, which also means that the whole way a place like that can operate on a global scale is very, very different and very, very ambiguous. The royals. The whole country has essentially a governing structure largely inherited from the British. If you look at its institutional infrastructure, it looks sort of the same like places in the West. I think if you were to make a same diagram of a city like Amsterdam or Rotterdam, it wouldn't look that different. However, if you look at the way this thing is manned, that's where the key difference emerge because on the right side, on the left side is the public sector, on the right side is the private sector. And it's not because of local dress that the faces look the same, it's because they are the same. Whereas in a normal free competition economy, you have to, in a way, relinquish your business interest in order to take a public office. Here, business interests are a prerequisite to take a public office, which means that you are dealing with something that is something between an enterprise and a state, and that can conveniently claim to be either, depending on what is the most opportunistic situation. Dubai is a net exporter of urban developments all across the world, particularly to Islamic countries, and very often to countries which have been ravaged by war. Essentially, the combined involvement of these three holdings stretches all the way from Morocco to Indonesia. Confidently predicting, this is another real estate affair in Dubai, one day all cities will be built like this. And this is kind of a shell shock, at least it was a shell shock to me, because I mean, I thought this was the way one day all cities were going to be built. The combined manifestos that I'd been taught and read and studied in university, anything from Le Corbusier's Vers une architecture to Delirious New York, Siam manifestos, etc. It's the essential, the book list that we had. And if you, in a way, put these titles over time, you also see something very, very weird. There's an abrupt stop, at least there is an abrupt stop to books about urbanism that claim to be blueprints, that claim to have a formula as to how things should happen. It's not that books have stopped, because books have stopped, but very often they've taken the form of internal critiques, etc., etc. But confident manifestos about the future of the cities have ended, and they have ended more or less at the same time that Fukuyama wrote his book, The End of History. The End of History apparently doesn't acquire manifestos anymore because apparently we agree on everything anyway. But in the wake of that neglect, in the wake of that stop, of course, something very interesting happened. While our cities were not subjected to the same rapid growth anymore as they've been previously in history, particularly in Asia, there was a sharp increase in urbanization. And our own discarded model of urbanization there often carried on applying. It was dusted off, and if you look at the average real estate sales of it, it is almost like a ville radieuse or like a plan voisin of Le Corbusier, just with Chinese advertisement. Urbanization in China is more than the response to a need. It's a manifest ideology about the extent of the progress of the country. If you compare these two things, the growth of the GDP per capita of China, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, and you compare it to the urban population, there is a one-on-one correlation that you wonder, is the urbanism the result of population, or is the urbanism a function simply of capital and GDP? There are cities in China built and continuously built that are completely empty. Nevertheless, more of them get built because it is more expensive to have a workforce dedicated to construction stand idle than, in a way, to stop building these cities. This is Ordos, a kind of enormous city in the north of China, which is like a ghost town, and not really a ghost town because ghost towns are abandoned, but this one never was inhabited, as was this one, as was this one. And this is the city that essentially formed the inspiration of the book. It is a very large new town in Angola, built by the Chinese, largely with the same principle, using Chinese labor, using Chinese products, etc., a kind of standalone machine that simply created an enormous city there in the middle of the country and built. Launched by the then Angola president Eduardo dos Santos, a kind of a master plan made by the Chinese, a very, very large, loose grid of urban development, overseen and brokered again by this man, a Frenchman, Pierre Falcone, who essentially, like the man in Kazakhstan, had a former life as an arms dealer during the Angola Civil War. And much of his fortune was invented in a consultancy, in a consultancy on construction, and he brokered essentially the deal between the Chinese and the Angolan government. Welcome. Essentially, so this is an excerpt from a promotional video about the whole thing. Sino-Angolan partnership at work. This is President Dos Santos showing the Chinese leadership around. This is a giant model that we also visited of that whole city, where on the spot he makes directives, more of green, more public space, etc., etc. The video contains school children in uniform in the new city, really all a kind of form of trading up for the then status of a country like Angola. Essentially, it takes care of the young, it takes care of the old. It's a city without barriers. It was exercised with all the modern convenience. What is wrong here? Etc. And all of that was done. And in theory, an enormous housing stock was provided over a financial deal over oil with the Chinese for the country. But a weird thing manifested. The cost of all of this meant that apartments were priced anything between $120,000 and $200,000, where the average Angolan gets by on $2 a day. The country didn't have a mortgage system in place. There was no capital construction in place to build this grip. So much to the delight of Western media, in 2012, when the city was realized, it remained empty, and it remained empty for years. This is Dave Mackenzie, who actually exposed the school children as actors, despite all the hype, and who showed endless footing of this enormous city with pristine new buildings which were uninhabited, empty parking lots, manicured lawns with nobody to walk on them, etc., etc., etc. An entirely fenced-off, pristine, almost like a life-size model being built. And of course what happened is that the inhabitants who couldn't afford to live in the city started building the same shanty towns all around the city. So you have a kind of an enormously strange contrast of actually houses that were built for these people but they can't afford, so the same mode and the same type of housing that, in a way, the old town that the new town was meant to get rid of, simply emerged overnight on the fences of this city. And in that sense, the city became a metaphor for Angola, and particularly the city of Luanda in general, which is a city with an enormously expensive center and a huge ring of people who just get to gaze at it. Angola, obviously one of the poorest nations on earth, actually has given birth to a city which is with the highest cost of living on earth. So that equality was in a way consolidated, and the whole real estate venture there played an enormous role in doing that. Empty cities which are in a way a result of capital exchange and an autonomous economic logic, do not just emerge in Africa or in China. The financial crisis of 2008 has made this phenomena, which you could call phantom urbanism, a kind of global phenomena. After 2008, a similar phenomena, a similar discrepancy between the cost of housing and the affordability of that housing started to go horribly wrong. This is north of Madrid, a town, Francisco Hernando, another new town, the city of Valdeluz, new, built, but already decaying without ever having been inhabited. a large new town which was only very partially finished, again with pristine roads, new trees, bicycle paths, signage and everything, but nobody there. And where actually the sign advertising the city is the most vibrant sign of life in the city. Same thing happened in other places. This is in Ireland, a new suburb, again, empty. It's a totally surreal site. Rio Vista, California. Was the interstate corridor, also a phenomenon that is in America. I was very intrigued by the phenomena because, I mean, we are all trained to think that architecture, homes, etc., are built in response to a certain need or a certain human use. But, I mean, there is increasingly much substance that seems to adhere to a very different logic. This is a book by a French economist, Thomas Piketty. The book has a very interesting analysis. What the book has analyzed over the course of history is two economic functions. One is the return on labor, one is the return on capital. To put it simply, one is how much money you make from working, the other one is how much money you make from having money, or having stuff, or having possessions. And his argument is that when you make more money from what you already have, then somebody else can work all they want, they will never catch up, because simply people who have will accumulate wealth faster than people who work for it. And he's analyzed this over history, where precisely the period after the war, the period of the welfare state, the period with labor union, was a period in history where actually under pressure, the return on labor was higher than the return on capital, with subsequent emancipatory waves, particularly in Western society, as a consequence. But also here, round about the fall of the Berlin Wall, round about the moment that opposing systems disappeared, the return on capital started to overtake the return on labor, with the subsequent inequality that we've seen emerging, not only in the US with the famous 1%ers, but actually throughout the Western world. This is a major issue. And in propelling this system, in propelling this kind of injustice, that which money is converted in plays an enormous role. These are the global economic assets, which means this is everything that essentially money is invested in or stored in. And it is real estate by far that is the largest category, larger than oil, larger than gold, larger than financial instruments, etc., 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 which is also, when real estate goes pear-shaped, or when mortgage loan systems goes pear-shaped, actually an entire economy can be derailed. Buildings cost money, but more importantly, buildings make money. Buildings make money precisely by existing. This is the Gherkin in London by Foster, realized in 2004. Now, in the 18 years or so of its existence, it has changed hands 3 times. Once to a Brazilian billionaire, and then the last time for about $1 billion, which means that in the course of its existence, it tripled in value simply from being traded, which means that the value of the whole thing is almost 3 times what it cost to build in the first place. And the ability of buildings to make money makes buildings play an entirely different role. Increasingly, buildings become something not for people looking for a home or for people looking for space, but for money looking space, particularly with very low interest rates that we see at present. The buildings becomes, in a way, a house for money. You look at Amsterdam, completely different than the Gherkin. In a single year, nearly 10% of all purchases made by foreign investors. You look at Vienna, there it's 15%. You look at a place like Australia, where there is 25 of all the real estate bought by foreign investors. New York, 30%. Vancouver, about a third, even more, often by Chinese buyers. And the interesting thing is that a lot of these buyers aren't even people. They aren't buyers that go to live there. They're very often either remote owners or mailbox companies simply investing money in the properties that they either rent out and in a lot of cases stand empty. London is, of course, a wonderful place when it comes to like that. And often the money that is invested in real estate, because of specific local laws, is dirty money. We've seen it recently with the Ukraine conflict and the London government cracking down on that type of money. And for whoever thinks that this is a show that happens in a world different from architecture, that is far away from architects and us, there can be kind of a rude awakening. This is our London project in Kensington, a sort of respectable piece of modern architecture, whitish, lots of glass, 90-degree angles. It has all the hallmarks of enlightened modern architecture, I guess. But this was one of its residents, which I found out through a newspaper article. Polina Kovaleva, an owner, a 21-year-old owner of one of the very, very large, very, very expensive ones, who turned out to be the stepdaughter of Sergei Lavrov, the current minister of Russian foreign affairs. And it's only in crisis moments like this that a lot of things come to light, that even your own work, after you've finished it, becomes complicit. Real estate also is a source of migration. Not a source of migration for the poor, but a source of migration for the rich. In the European Union, it is possible, a very impenetrable fortress, very hard to reach for immigrants from North Africa or the Middle East, but very, very penetrable fortress for those who actually, with enough money to buy property. This is Hungary, which gave out residence permits and passports to foreign owners, and Hungary is one of the most xenophobic countries in Europe, so that is ironic. If you look at that on a world scale, this was in 2014, the global rich spend an estimated $2 billion on acquiring nationalities, and mostly that happened through the purchase of property. Oleg Deripaska, Russian oligarch, these days is a Cypriot. Rami Makhlouf, a very wealthy businessman from Syria these days, is an Austrian. And the American Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, passes on today as a New Zealander. There is even a ranking on the internet, which are the best countries to buy citizenship if you're looking for that type of investment. So all of that is a kind of a weird race, you could say, with ever more ridiculous amounts of money going on. One yip in Amsterdam, $16.2 million for an apartment. For Dutch standards, that is an enormous amount of money. Bennett LeBeau in New York along Central Park, $45 million. This is an interesting one. King property tycoon Nick Candy buys an apartment in Hyde Park, but he's for $60 million. But he's also the developer of Hyde Park. So what happened is that he essentially bought it from himself. One part of his holding company sold it to another part of his holding company as one of the first buyers, simply to set the pricing level of the ensuing buyers that would buy there. This is what I believe to be the record today, to see Dell in Vignoli's Park Avenue Tower for over $100 million. This is an interesting project as well. The evening falls, and you think that it's the Residents Association, which has a very carefully coordinated effort that only every 14 floors people are allowed to put the lights on. in some kind of energy saving scheme, but the reality is that the lights are on only at the plant rooms, and the rest of the apartments are for sale and stand mostly empty. That tower has an enormous history, an enormous record of accumulating wealth. Qatari businessman, 16.2 million for a 3-bedroom condominium, of which the inside looks like a furniture showroom. Another Saudi magnate. This is the interior. It looks like it's furnished by the same furniture showroom as the other one. That was bought for 87 million, recently sold for nearly double, with the same furniture. Some of these sales are very high profile. Jennifer Lopez and Alex Rodriguez, 15th Condo and Park Avenue. Again, they have the same interior decorator as the Saudi real magnate, and it's their love nest, but it doesn't look like a lot of love is happening, and that one's meanwhile sold with a nice little profit as well. And you wonder about what is the effect of this on architecture? When architecture's primarily function is not to be lived in, not to be used, but to be traded, does that have an effect on form? The thin tower with 360-degree views essentially is a series of shop windows for furniture. You have no neighbors, etc., because you don't need neighbors, and in a way that gets taken to ever greater extremes. I mean, recently completed shop one is even higher, even thinner. I mean, defying the laws of structural engineering to an increasing extent. And if you, in a way, extrapolate that trend, so you have very thin Park Avenue tower, an even thinner shop building, but you could take it further to the point that buildings, if they're only traded anyway, could become so thin that they end up being pieces of sculpture in the middle of the city, which is what the skyline of certain cities suspiciously look like. And all of this principle, of course, has an effect at the other end of the spectrum as well. If you look at housing, at housing affordability over the last years, there's a very disturbing pattern. Median income admittedly has risen. The loans you can get from the bank up and down tend to be fairly intact, but house prices have simply evolved in such manner that even the most general, even the most secure loan sort of only get you halfway of buying what you need. If you look at the most livable cities in the world, there's an ironic thing coming into play. The most livable cities are invariably rich cities with high salaries. But more than rich cities, they are expensive cities. So if you do the math on the definition of an affordable homes, which is essentially a mortgage of 2.5 times your annual income, and you apply that formula onto the salaries and the house prices of those cities, and calculate how many square meters you can buy for a maximum mortgage, an interesting pattern emerges. Vienna, the most livable city in the world, the size of an affordable family home is 15 square meters. That is 3 by 5 meters. That's a person. And so what is 15 square meters? That is the size, it's a little bigger than a maximum security prison cell, a little bigger than a caravan, but it's not a lot. It's in fact smaller than what was defined as the existence minimum, the minimum existing of communal housing by the modernists at the early 20th century. It's about the size of a container. And of course we see a lot of container housing going up in the name of modernity, but in fact a desperate response to a bad situation. You could say, very weirdly, that this is what has happened, that the promise of modernism. And this happens in classical, postmodern, modern, no matter what the style of architecture is, all buildings are subject to this, that in essence, a century later, the Bauhaus was founded in 2019, a century later, we have traded down. And this is, of course, if there is a hostility against modernity and modernism today, it is, of course, precisely this that accounts to it. It's not a matter of taste, it's not a matter of stylistic, it's because simply unwittingly, the repertoire of architecture, even of good architecture, even of ideological architecture, has become subject to those financial principles. This is, believe it or not, a regular home in a French city, but a century ago it looked like this. It was a Corbusier in Besnus. We see buildings, the Palais de la République, being reconstructed as a schloss that once stood in its place. This is an administrative court in Skopje, a modernist building which has recently received a makeover, and now it looks like this. This is the populist prime minister of Macedonia, Nikola Gruevski, who over a corruption scandal, I think, fled the country dressed as a woman in 2016. But that's besides the point. In 1963, Skopje was a modern town. It had an earthquake. With money from the United Nations, a team led by Kenzo Tanga and local architects worked on the reconstruction of Skopje with an impressively metabolist and modern plan, supposed to be executed by locals and in phases. And the last phases of that plan look like this, with a little Arc de Triomphe there. Strangely, and this is the point I want to make, there is a curious déjà vu that we're seeing, where protests, once advocating freedom, progress, once advocating an impatience with progress, have been replaced by protests rather against the fallout of a certain progress. This is, of course, the yellow vests in Paris, where in the 1970s people advocated against climate change and limited resources. This is the Club of Rome. The 21st century sees the overall mitigation of that thing, the annihilation, so nothing. Where the 20th century was an age of sexual liberation, we see the 21st, in a way, a grandiose protection of family values. Whereas the Berlin Wall fell in the 20th century, we see the overall reconstruction of walls appearing almost anywhere, in the sense that Fukuyama's beautifully homogeneous world is currently a world scarred by walls, and this is where we are. You can wonder how to operate in this world. I mean, when apparently, despite your good intentions as an architect, there is no way of escaping some of the principles I showed. You could say, as some say, you ought to say, that you simply stop working in any regime that is not democratic. In the current situation, you could sort of say that that means a loss of about a third of the white dots. But of course, things do not end there. The days that we could define non-democratic so clearly as we could a while ago are over. And despite Putin's horrific actions in the Ukraine, he receives visitors. Bolsonaro from Brazil, Modi from India, Pamaroso, South Africa, Orban from Hungary, member of the European Union, Serbia, and even a current very potentially successful contender in the elections for the French presidency is a staunch supporter of Putin, and even closer to home, anything less than hating Putin is treason, and Trump was basically right about everything. What's going to happen in 2024? Nobody knows. It simply means that if this is where we stand currently, this is where we could stand in a matter of years. And if I then, in a way, project our portfolio, it doesn't look good. I mean, basically, it means relinquishing almost anything. It leads to an inherent possibility to practice architecture. That is, if you define architecture as a simple function of territory. One of the things we are debating and we are thinking in response to a situation we see coming is that from a global office in terms of territory, we could move to a universal office in terms of thematic involvement. So rather than diversifying the places where you work, could you diversify the thing you work on? Could you come to a definition of architecture that is not global, but maybe holistic? And of course, since 20 years, we've had a think tank, which has always professed to be about something that is architectural thinking. While OMA, our regular office, is involved in architecture proper, AMO is involved in architecture between quotation marks, and that is essentially based on the following thing. If you look at all of these words, architect, arena, blueprint, construct, platform, all of these words have a literal architectural meaning. All of these words also have a metaphorical meaning, where they apply to systems, where they apply to the digital, where they apply to strategies, to thinking. And in a way, all of them have a literal meaning, and all of them have an almost purely conceptual meaning. Since its existence, AMO has been a vehicle in our office to describe the world in economic terms and in political terms. It has looked at the future of urbanization. It has, in tandem, looked at its flip side, the development of the countryside. It's been involved in issues as diverse as energy, high-tech farming, and the natural consequence of high-tech farming, which would be pharma. More recently, it has looked at the future of the hospital. It's looked at robotics and automation, its implication for construction, applied in, for instance, a very large-scale hospital, which is a film. It continues to be involved in education, even in the last 2 years, of course, mostly virtual, where some of the principles that I've outlined in this lecture have actually acquired the status of an an educational program, to simply raise awareness of the context of architecture, which is so necessary. And pretty soon, AMO will also have its own publishing company, publishing house, and that is, of course, a testament to the all-importance of writing, which brings me back to square one. This book is available on Amazon for $28, but it's available at the back at a discount of $8 for $20 for whoever is interested. That was it. Yeah.
So I think they're going to turn on the lights. Yeah? Okay. I'll start off by asking Rainier questions, but please, after a while, jump in. These are more meant to be icebreakers than anything. Thanks so much for bringing up Thomas Piketty, which plays, his thinking plays such an important role in Four Walls. And the way that you talk about it there is that, I mean, just so kind of personally, that you grew up in an era where you were the beneficiary of social housing, and the idea that social housing was designed to be purely functional in accommodating the needs of the way people live, and that social housing was this remarkable era when capital was dedicated to housing the middle class. And then as you jump forward and talk about the Piketty model, where architecture is not so much designed in the service of providing spaces that people use, but as a real estate investment. And as you put it, greatly, that that now architecture is not a space for people, but a space for money. The way, how do you see that play out in the current book? I mean, is it to say that it's happening at the scale of cities, that we now see the investment in cities purely for the parking of money over the inhabitation of people, or is it more complex than that?
Well, it plays out in this book in the sense that the line, cities are not for people looking for a home, but for money looking for a home, is a line literally uttered by one of the characters, who is a nauseating American who follows the protagonist around. You never quite know whether he's an ignorant tourist or a member of the Secret Service, and it doesn't get any clearer. But it's clearly that this book is about a city which is the sum total of everybody's ulterior motive. The ulterior motive for money launderers to, launder money from the Angolan War, which isn't Angola in the book, but it's called the Republic. For the Chinese, who see an opportunity to expand both their construction industry and, of course, their political influence. And ultimately for an architect for whom it is a career vessel. I mean, the architect has a very well-known father who carries the same name, so whatever he's accomplished, because he has the same name, the credit still goes to his father, and he sees this as a welcome opportunity to escape, to make a name on his own in a remote place like Africa, where he also suspects the office won't catch up with him. But of course it does. But I mean, the book is a caricature in a way in which the trends shown here all come to play out. I think we're, in general, is it avoidable? It's very, very different. It's very, very difficult. In my own country, I think 70%, when I grew up, 70% of people rented their homes. From the state or from public housing associations. And that meant that a relatively small part of your income went to housing, which means that people had the money to put their kids through schooling, which at the time I think was also subsidized, et cetera, but it allowed people like, I was the first in my family to go to university, and there are a lot like me, et cetera. Then in the 80s, with the whole conservative revolution, people started to own their homes. And of course that was interesting, because then rather than paying rent, which is money down the drain, then paying your mortgage was a form of saving. So the first generation benefited, but precisely their success in a way has made it harder for subsequent generation to undergo the same thing. So in a way that sellout led to the emancipation of one generation, almost at the expense of every generation that followed after. And it's incredibly difficult to break the cycle, because the only thing to do is to make all housing cheaper. But then whoever has saved money in the forms of owning his house would protest. So it's a perfect recipe to set up generations against each other, which is of course what you see happening. Yeah. I mean, I don't think Me Too is all about sex. For instance, I think there is a power. I mean, I think it was Oscar Wilde. He said everything in life is about sex, except sex. Sex is about power. And to some extent, I think some of the things you see being played out, and some of the outrage you see being played out, is a function of a kind of a felt unfair inequality, mm-hmm. which cannot be named because it's also a pillar of the system, yeah. and therefore almost everything else is blown up to an incredible degree. I think that's what we see happening. Yeah. And that is not to minimize, let's say, all the phenomena that this is about. That is not to minimize the Me Too movement at all, but I think it is ultimately a function of something even bigger, of an elephant in the room that simply cannot be named, yeah. because then the whole system would collapse.
Yeah. I mean, I find that super interesting, like in your analysis of housing, in that with the Piketty model, if the idea of social housing is to create something that is livable, that might be, I don't know what, 800,000 square feet, that now a house might be designed to be 3,000, 4,000 square feet, not because it would make it more livable, but it would make it a better product to sell. The resale value on the house would be really much higher. Along those lines, I mean, I think what's really interesting is that 1991 aligns with the kind of peak career moment for boomers, the generation that acquired that wealth during that time, and that if
What
you
was
pull,
the last year that you are a boomer?
I think it depends on
The
who
definition.
defines it. Yeah, but like now I think with Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, that there's a higher preference to rent because there's this notion of stuck in place that really, regardless of where you want to go, that there's certain limitations societally that that really don't allow for mobility, and that within the last 4 years, independent of the pandemic, people are wishing to become renters rather than own or are forced to. Do you see that as something that is an exacerbation of the Piketty model, that really real estate has gone in a different direction, but that there are entire generations younger than the boomers that don't play the same kind of role in real estate investment that the boomer generation did?
Yeah, but I mean, do we get what we want or do we want what we get? I mean, you can see this as a manifestation of a different preference, but you can also see the preference as an expression out of the impossibility of the other thing. I mean, I showed the kind of example of Vignoli's shop and then the Brancusi, of course, as a caricature, but I mean, it's a prediction, and maybe it's an expression of hope that at a certain moment the system will escalate into such an absurdity that it will escalate under its own absurdity. But and that may happen. The question is, what will be the cost of that? You know, if we would apply the same speculative logic that we apply to buildings, if we would apply it to food or water, I mean, we would all starve to death.
Yeah.
You know, and housing it's I mean, it's not like Rolex watches, or it's not like collector's item. It is a primary human need that in a way has become subject of an extreme speculation, and I think that cannot continue. And if it discontinues, then I don't know, will there be another 1929? Is that another stock market crash? And I think what we've seen in 2008 with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, that may only be a precursor of something much more drastic.
Great, okay. Wonderful, yeah.
Not great.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, great that you answered it, but great that it's exactly in line with the tenor of the book. I mean, I find it super interesting that in delirious New York, that the office tower is seen as the ideal typology for the 20th century, in that you could take a square foot of land or square area of land and multiply it infinite times for rental income. But basically what you're saying is that it's an entirely different model with the residential tower of the 21st century, where it's purely about parking money. It's not even about a dimension that's defined by occupation and use.
No,
I mean, in that way, would you say that is the difference in the two models, that there was a conceit of it being used in the 20th century, whereas now
I think
it's almost
the delirious New York office tower is actually it's a multiplication of the lot, an nth amount of time, giving rise to different forms of human use, you know, in a totally artificial context. But I mean, the use and the program and the activities were central to the whole theory, whereas of course here you have the material thing being reduced and almost exorcising the use for the sake of materiality, and that is a very, very different trend. But in general, I think, you know, modernity, and in as much as modernity relies on technology and processes, it's very important to be aware that these processes are essentially agnostic. What we thought was ideological was only ideological when it had a political system in tandem. If you look at the traits of modern architecture, which is rapid construction, rationalization, the elimination of details. So you could build faster. When you can build faster and more efficient, you can build cheaper. So it is cheaper for people to have a home, so more people can have a home. Now, the first four things still apply. You can build cheaper, but then the saving on construction actually start to serve profits to a further trading than rather making things available cheap. So if you can create them cheaply, it doesn't mean they're made available cheap.
It creates more scarcity.
Yeah, and the same repertoire, that serves one purpose under one system, serves almost the opposite purpose in a different system.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, and that's true of architecture. I think in some ways that is true of the internet and all of those kind of things. Technological breakthroughs of modernity are essentially agnostic, which means that you can spell modernity with a capital M, as Bruno Latour says, in one age, and with a small case m in the next.
Yeah, one thing I want to ask with the amazing diagrams that you show, which I think is in many ways a legacy of the AMO discipline of trying to crystallize a condition to its essence so that it could be understood in a way that then action can be taken by an architect. Whereas now in the book, you describe situations that are fundamentally unknowable, that it is a condition of vicissitude that the architect is in. And so with AMO today, do things like diagrams have a purpose, or are there ways to graphically model what you're witnessing in the professional world with any insight that can be shared? Or do things simply stay secrets?
I don't know. I think there's a big difference between what architects know and what is generally known. Unfortunately, I mean, architecture is a wonderfully myopic, insular profession that loves to revel in its own achievements, etc., but very often blissfully unaware of context and blissfully unaware of the ulterior motives that their profession is being put to use for. I think maybe to a lot of people what I'm telling are open doors. Nevertheless, with four walls and the effect of the book, I noticed what a shock the obvious can still be to a profession. So I don't think it's necessarily a question of secrets. I think it's a question that in today's world, there's more and more to be known. Specialisms tend to withdraw increasingly on their own turf, which means that a certain awareness of the context of your specialism is becoming scarcer. And I think actually diagrams are a very potent means to assess that, because they can simplify things up to a point where even if you have limited time to look across the fence, something may dawn on you.
Yeah, great. I think now would be a really great time if you could read a short passage from the book. I think maybe one that would be apropos to what you're talking about is the news cycle of the realization of the imminent disaster of this new town.
So it was not long, that one?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, I'll try. It wasn't long before Rodriguez's worst fear materialized. The Al Jazeera post resulted in the content of the A Verdade article going viral. A Verdade is a fictitious newspaper in the book, Portuguese word for the truth. News of an African ghost town, unprecedented in scale, traveled the globe, neatly in line with its successive time zones. After Al Jazeera, the websites of The Guardian and then the BBC followed. A few hours later, reports of Bilunga, the ghost, being a ghost town, were also on CNN and various other American news sites. With the news reaching the US, the blame game had started. The usual suspects were singled out: corrupt African governments, and Chinese financiers looking for a quick win. Western media reveled in the apparent Chinese involvement of the fiasco, eagerly describing Belunga as the turning point of Chinese influence in Africa. The European architect wasn't spared. It was the architect who provided the single, recognizable face to the events, and the media were grateful for it, happily engaging in a context who could best mock the author of this disaster. He was referred to as the master disaster planner on the BBC's website, an ironic allusion to the title under which his involvement had initially been launched. Fox News described him as Mr. Vacancy, following on that this number of empty dwellings could only have been produced by an architect with an empty head, which in turn was expanded upon by the rest of the American Rico by describing Rodrigo as a vacuous architect of a vacant city. The penultimate comment, however, on his performance came from the architecture critic of The Guardian, you know who that is, complimenting him on his abilities as a sculptor.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Rainier. Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask of our guest? Yeah. Oh, Mike. Yeah.
Where do you think architects stand in their ability to reclaim architecture from this trend of wealth finding a home rather than people finding a home, and spaces generating identity?
Well, those are different things, but I think architects on their own do not stand very strong. I mean, architects also have a stake in this, because architecture, in some cases, is a brand that also helps. And I think that, strangely enough, the only way for architects to reclaim a certain form of influence is to directly connect with users again. We, of course, have the majority of apartments like this are sold via property developers who second guess what people want. You never talk to anyone anymore that ends up using your products. The classic dialogue of an architect-client is in a way replaced by an architect and a middleman in the form of the property developer, and that is almost who supposedly knows what the markets want, knows what people want, but doesn't know a damn thing other than the Excel sheets that define the logic. So I think, to some extent, a certain mobilization of participation or participatory processes in architecture could be very helpful, although most architects hate the notion of participation. I mean, they hate the notion of going to evenings where future residents or laymen have all kinds of silly comments on their masterpieces, etc., etc. But I think only if they, in a way, park their pride or snobbishness in that sense, then I think there might be some room to reclaim. But I think the profession in and of itself also suffers some serious dysfunctionalities in many ways, and it certainly doesn't go free. I wouldn't, I would portray, in the context of all of this, I would portray architects as victims and perpetrators at the same time.
Can you clarify how participation helps with the prices?
Well, in essence, the question was to what extent you design people for users again. When you design something for a specific use, the possibility to speculate it, simply to sell it to anyone, diminishes. I think the notion of, most of the buildings I showed, most of the things, are incredibly generic products that maybe have a special facade or something, but they are all designed to take a kind of middle of the road effect so that they alienate as few buyers as possible. If you make something very specific and target it to one buyer, the possibility to sell and resell, and also the motive to sell and resell, will diminish, because people will want to stay in it maybe for the rest of their life. And I think that, clearly, architects themselves, they're not a banking system. They're not politicians. They're certainly not omnipowerful. But I think a general trend where the benefit of architecture could be specificity, again, instead of genericness, could actually be part of a movement, of a larger movement that undoes this.
So it doesn't seem surprising to me that you ended up writing a novel in some ways, because the way you world build, and always AMO and OMA's like genius, I think, was in explaining the world, kind of as you were saying, Jeffrey, in ways that were comprehensible. But to me, the explanations that you gave tonight don't leave space for architecture, or the logical end to architecture is basically to write a novel in which you've written a different kind of world. And I wonder if you think your next book, in other words, the next plan for architecture, has any way out of the trap that you're talking about at this global scale.
My next book is ready. And it's being copy edited as we speak, but I can't say too much about it. And thinking in response to your question whether it'll help, I'm not sure. I think, I'm not yet there. The solution to any problem starts with the frank acknowledgement that there is a problem. And that's, in a way, what I'm doing through writing, in a way, paving the ground for a general realization that there is or maybe a problem, to also inspire action. I mean, I think in the context of all of this, any ready-made solution by an architect that would make all of us live happily ever after would be as idiotic as some of the stuff I showed.
Yeah.
Well, so in a way, I take it step by step. I've taken it upon me as one of the probably very, very few architects to simply, name things by their name. I even show our own projects, not to boast about them, but what happens. Most PR departments of architects' offices would sort of hope this doesn't get too many clicks and will be replaced by more urgent news tomorrow, etc. I don't know. Something like that is telling you something, whether you like it or not, and maybe the best thing you can do is talk about it and tell somebody else. I think, essentially, a lot of the values of modern architecture, also the values that I was brought up with to appreciate in university, I still value them. I think they were all there for the best of intention, but I think the system is running on empty, and the stuff we've been taught is becoming ever more limited in terms of being able to make the difference. So, I think the whole thing starts by looking at the world around you, and maybe adjust the curriculum of what you teach people, what you're involved in, and that's what the latter part of it is about. It is also about an attempt to apply the typical thinking of an architect, which I would describe as non-linear, spatial. But you can interpret that in many ways. We've worked with business consultants occasionally on very large projects. We've worked with the like of McKinsey. They're very smart, they're very business savvy, they commandeer incredibly high fees, but I've always struck to me how incredibly limited they are in terms of their linear logic, in terms of simply blanketly assuming that the whole world works according to that logic. And I found in a situation like that your lateral thinking, etc., can actually bring quite valuable things to the table, even in subjects which, to begin with, you don't know everything about. If I sort of look at the subjects we've been involved recently, which has been partly agriculture, partly energy issues, and healthcare, which have been prevalent topics in the office. We all came to the table with very little real knowledge compared to all the experts that were at the table. Nevertheless, we did have quite a big impact, to the point that I think the first hospital we worked with, somebody came to the office and I said, but we've never done a hospital. Why are you here? And he said, that's precisely why we're here. You are partly unburdened by the knowledge of so many specialists, etc., etc. And so I think there are things we can do, but they're not as straightforward as if we do this from here on, it's all going to be fine. I think what we could do is at least explore alleys where things could be different.
One question back there. One last question.
Yeah, I read recently. Hi there. Thanks so much. I read recently that actually Canada is planning on banning foreign real estate investment for like 2 years in an upcoming bill. And I wonder, it kind of feels like they're tackling it on a large scale, but there's like multiple scales of this type of thing. It can happen within a country, it can happen within a city. Like, is ultimately the fundamental issue that, you know, real estate is a speculative asset, and is the way forward like kind of tenancy in common and like tenants directly owning things? Like what kind of futures do you see, I guess?
Well, I mean, New Zealand has done the same thing prior to Canada, and I think there are certain cities which are banning it. The weird thing here, I mean, going on, is that in some way, the remedy against the negative effects of globalization, and with it comes global capitals, very often seem to undo globalization. So that, and that you see in the current political landscape, that, you know, social issues and the protecting of social issues and xenophobia eerily go hand in hand. And I think that is somehow depressing. In certain ways. I think it is very important to preserve. I mean, our office grew as a result of the world going global, and I will always remember this period from 1991 till 2022, because I think with Russia manifesting the way it does now, something fundamentally has really, really changed. Hopscotch wrote a book, you know, The Short 20th Century. I think we've just lived through an even shorter 21st century, and that we're really coming to the end of an era where maybe the internet will not survive as a global thing, etc. There is no telling what is coming, but something has become visible that we now know, that we now realize that we cannot unknow. And I'm very and the more I see this period ending, the more sentimental I become about it in tandem, despite the effects I've shown. And I really hope it becomes possible that there are ownership models which in a way can avoid the pitfalls of the previous things, that there are forms of collective ownership, that there are, I mean, the financial system is often also very creative about finding those things, and that to some extent, you know, that it is possible to go abroad, to own something abroad, to an office like ours. It's when we started in the 90s, you know, everybody came to work in the Netherlands, and we've seen a situation where within Europe, within the EU, within the Netherlands, immigration policies, labor policies become stricter and stricter and stricter. And even hiring an American in the office now is a fucking nightmare. You know, and it was so essential, you know, that it was people from wherever that worked, that it was so essential to have somebody from LA work on a Dutch housing project. You know, that wonderful, carefully engineered permanent mismatch is at the core of all the work, and I see that being harder and harder and harder. So, I mean, I do hope, you know, that the world as a whole survives.
Yeah. I mean, I think that as distressing as the book is, and I really encourage it because it's really funny, that I think it does much of what you say, in that it reveals problems that parallel distresses that people from different generations are experiencing as they try to rent or buy a home, and maybe the two together lead for a hopeful post-2022 path. Thank you, Rainier. Thank you very much.